This is Twit.
Apple created screen time to allow parents to control the use of their children's devices. Google has one of these as well on Android phones. So they're all kind of doing this. But kids have always been very crafty, I know from experience. More so than even Apple engineers in Cupertino would like to admit, I imagine. And that is making things difficult for parents, ultimately. Joining us to talk about how screen time is failing for parents is Reed Albergotti from the Washington Post. Welcome back to the show, Reed.
Thanks for having me.
It's great to have you back. So I'm an Android user. From the outside looking in, I think I've always kind of assumed that the closed nature of iOS actually ensured that a feature like this would be bulletproof. And I also realized that in technology, nothing is bulletproof. But anyways, more so than maybe without, if it was from someone else. How is screen time supposed to work? And what assurances has Apple given to users about its effectiveness right now?
Well, it's supposed to work as a built-in function on the phone where you turn this thing on and you're now in control of your kid's phone. So they can't do anything without you knowing, without you giving them permission. And the way it actually works in practice is that kids, get frustrated because all of a sudden they're trying to go on TikTok or YouTube or what have you, and they get a notification saying they're not allowed. And they start playing around with the settings on the phone, turning the phone off and on. They just basically press every button until they find a way around the screen time. And it turns out there are lots of these bugs out there, and they talk about it on Reddit, they post about it on YouTube. I mean, it's amazing how much information you can find out there on how to get around screen time. And Apple really has been very slow to fix these bugs, and that's really frustrated some of the parents that I talked to for this article.
Yeah, I can imagine that. Along that line specifically, obviously, like you say, kids are finding these hacks, almost stumbling on these hacks in some ways, but they know where to turn to find them. Why do you think Apple isn't kind of buttoning up these open holes as quickly as kids are finding them, or as parents even know about them?
I really can't answer that question definitively, but what I can say is I talked to all of these parents, and some of them have called Apple customer service and gone back and forth complaining about these bugs. And they've asked Apple that question, and Apple hasn't really told them that they're going to fix these bugs. And what the parents say is they don't really think this is a high priority for Apple. And that sentiment sort of makes sense, because it is a little odd to have a company that has an extremely popular consumer product coming out with ways for people to use that product less. It's kind of a strange situation. And really, this came after about a year ago, after shareholders complained to Apple's board that the company wasn't doing enough to address screen time addiction, which is, a growing problem. So it could be, and I think some of the parents have surmised this, that Apple was sort of pressured into coming out with this product, and then it's not a top priority for the company.
Could you speak a little bit more in detail about some of the ways that folks are circumventing the screen time? So you've talked about them looking up YouTube videos or Reddit. What are some of the hacks that are being used?
Yeah, so I actually played around with this on my own. I had a phone set up as a kid. My actual kids are a little too young to practice on, so I did it by myself. And one of the ones I found really entertaining was, so if you have YouTube installed on your phone and your parents limit the amount of time you can spend on YouTube, so if you hit that limit, what you can do is open up iMessage, which isn't blocked by default. And a lot of parents like to keep iMessage open so that, their kids can continue to communicate with them. You open up iMessage, and the YouTube app is embedded within iMessage. So you can just open up the YouTube app and search for whatever video you want to watch and watch anything you want. So that was one. Another one, which seems to have been fixed in iOS 13, but existed for a very long time, is when kids reach their time limit, they would open up the clock settings and just change the time. So that seemed to get around it. And you could see if you went back and looked at these message boards, you could see parents complaining about this for months and months, and Apple, really not doing anything about it. Although finally in iOS 13, that seems to have been fixed. And then I think the most entertaining one was one of the parents said that her kid just started turning the phone on and off, just on and off, and pressing a bunch of buttons, and he called it colliding the system. And eventually,
that's great.
He would get around screen time by doing that.
Yeah, as I'm hearing you talk about this, and as I'm really thinking about how Apple has implemented this is just a feature that is by default residing in the settings, right, on iOS. And it makes me think about how Google has approached this as well. Google has something called Family Time. And we use it in our household. Our kids, they have tablets. They use them on the weekends. And so we're able to control the tablets. And the way Google does this a little bit differently, I think, from Apple is it's not a setting that's just in there. So it's not a setting that can be turned on. And if you are able to turn it off, you get to the full thing. The way Google does it is it's from the beginning when you're actually setting up the phone. So I say, activate Family Time with this email address. Now I go to the device and I set it up with that email address, and it sets up a limited version of Android, a limited access version of Android right from the beginning. So there's just literally no way to get to those settings the way it's set up right there. Just kind of makes me think, is that a better approach? I don't know if there's really much of a question in there, but it's just kind of a thought that, maybe this is one of those points where Apple does their system one very specific way, and they do it well for a number of things. But I don't know, is that just simply not working in this case? There could be a better way, right?
I think it's a fair point. And, part of the reason we looked at iOS versus Android is that, of all the parents we talked to and parenting experts, they said that iOS is just by far, the most popular operating system for parents buying their kids' phones. It seems like that's what kids want. But there are a lot of other options out there. And even on iPhone, you can use a bunch of third-party apps that do control, your kid's phone. Those ones actually seem to have more loopholes if you talk to parents.
Right.
And I think the reason for that is that Apple is not an open ecosystem, so they don't allow those apps full access to the operating system. And I think that's a real challenge for companies that are trying to do this on iOS. But I think there are other approaches. It's interesting hearing you talk about Family Time, because if you actually set up an account for your kid on an iPhone, even if you put in their age as, an 11-year-old, by default, they're allowed to download any app, including ones that are meant for, 17 plus. And they can get into a lot of adult content that way. So it definitely requires a lot of knowledge, a lot of research on the part of parents if they're gonna buy an iPhone, to figure out how to safeguard the phone.
Now,
Mikah.
This is probably speaking. I know it is. It is speaking from a place of privilege. I don't know what word to use here, because it may not be a privilege that I don't have kids. But speaking from a place maybe of ignorance, I guess, of not having kids.
Yeah.
Is there not a role for the parents to play in the conversation? Like the fact that I get it, but the fact that we have to set up these rules and put in place these different policies, can that not in some way be helped by explaining to the child, like, this is why these rules are in place, this is why I am suggesting this, and this is why, you can't use your phone after this time? Are they then less likely to try to circumvent a service if they know, and there's just rules and regulations in the house that we don't use our phones after this time? Is that too much to hope for? I don't even know who I'm asking here. I'm kind of asking you, Jason, but I don't know. Maybe that's just too much to hope for.
Yeah, well, you got two parents here that can answer. Reed, go first, and I'll answer as well.
Well, my kids aren't old enough yet. My kids are 3 and 1, so I haven't had to deal with the technology problem yet. But I will say that I went into having kids with all these ideas about what I was going to do as a parent and how I was going to be different than all the other parents. And that all just goes out the window once you're kind of in it, once you're in the trenches. So I think this is it's just a constant struggle for any parent. But that is the conclusion that some of the parents I talked to came to, which is you're really not going to be able to stop kids from using this technology. It's just not going to happen. So the best you can hope for is that you do talk to them about it and you do sort of inoculate them or try to inoculate them from the ills of the internet. You got to explain, like, there are predators out there who are going to use these apps to try and do bad things to you. Or, if you overuse this stuff, if you spend all day playing Fortnite or watching YouTube, you're not going to get your schoolwork done. And that's going to have, long-term consequences for your life. So hopefully your kids listen to that message. But, I think as a parent, I've realized, like, your kids just don't always do what you want them to do. So I have a lot of sympathy for the parents out there.
Yeah, I would completely agree from my perspective. And I completely agree with what you said, Mikah. I do not think that a tool like this is the definitive be all end all of any of this. But I do think that it is a tool to employ along with other things like educating your children and everything. My kids are still young enough that they're not at the, they're 9 and 6. So I feel like I'm starting to kind of venture into the territory where more conversation around this stuff is necessary. But I appreciate that there are tools that exist that allow me to kind of button things up a little bit to feel like they are more protected, whether they make an intentional or unintentional mistake online.
Yeah, and I want to be clear here. Like, I am not making an excuse for the technology, which I don't think that you thought that, but just to be clear, I think this technology should work and should give parents the tools that they need. And I think especially regarding the latter point that you made here, where what if my kid accidentally sees something or interacts with someone that they should not be interacting with or seeing? That's horrifying. That's scary. And this device is a portal and it gives you access to any number of things. So having it be buttoned down, I think, is very important. And if a child can get around these things and suddenly the kid is able to access something that could harm them in some way, that's frightening. And I understand where that concern specifically comes from.
Yeah. And one other thing I would say along these lines is, that, and I'm curious to know, Reed, if you talk to any parents that were that saw this as like a glimmer of creativity in their child, to understand that, like, they have this device and they were actually able through creative means to do something that a lot of other people have overlooked. Like, there's some gold to be found there as far as that's concerned. Would you agree?
Oh, yeah, you're absolutely right. Parents do. Usually they end up taking the kid's phone away and maybe grounding them for a little while, but they certainly appreciate the ingenuity. And I think a lot of parents, especially just reading the message boards, a lot of parents were saying, I'm proud of my kid for, figuring out a way around the rules. Like, that's how you get it's how you get ahead in life.
Critical thinking.
And I think there's also this acknowledgement that so much of the world now revolves around computers. So if you can be adept at this type of technology, you do have kind of an advantage. But I think there's this flip side to it, which is that kids' brains are simply not, certain parts of their brains are just not developed until a certain age, and they can't make perfect decisions all the time. What's crazy about the modern internet, this mobile world, is that kids can so quickly get into trouble that can have lasting impacts on their lives. When I was a kid, you could get access to things you weren't supposed to get access to, but you had to go through a lot of effort, and it probably the consequences probably weren't as dire as they are today. Now, the time between a kid making a bad decision on one of these social networks and like literally being kidnapped or human trafficked for some of these kids, it can be a matter of hours or a day or two. So it's so fast. Like, not to take this in a dark turn, but I have been researching this stuff, and it's amazing.